Michael with United Veterans Worldwide for an exciting interview today with Giselle. And I don't want to say a lot about her yet. I'll just let her introduce herself first, and then we'll go right into it. Giselle, will you share some information with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Giselle Drew Welsh. I recently just retired from the military after having joined in 2008. I joined as a reserve infantier, so infantry has been my trade the entire time. Even as a reservist, the nice thing about that is you have a lot of flexibility. You can work as little or as much as you want. So out of, all the time in there, I worked a lot. I was on full-time contracts the majority of my career, which gave me a lot of opportunities to work with amazing people, both reserve and reg force. On top of that, I've been an advocate for mental health for veterans and their families for about a decade now. And I've been fortunate and lucky enough for that to have been recognized and received a Minister of Veterans Affairs commendation and Queen's Platinum Jubilee Medal as well. So, which really, I guess, solidifies and validates the work I've put into it, which is nice and just motivates me to do that more for other people. Most recently, I am Mrs. Canada Universe, and thank you. And I'm actually the first Canadian service member to actually win a Canadian national pageant title like this. And thank you. I'll be going internationally now to represent Canada at Mrs. Universe in October. So yeah, I guess that's kind of me in a nutshell if I had to sum myself up.
Yeah, that's incredible. So there's several things that you mentioned that really stand out to me. One, you call it Infantier. Is that like the French word of infantry, or?
Oh, I guess because the infantry is the trade, and then my role in that is an infantier.
Okay.
Infantry soldier.
Yeah. Which is so unique because in the U.S. military, I was infantry for a number of years when I went to Iraq, and no females in the infantry. So when we go to the field, it was guys with guys. We would have female medics, but we didn't have any in the infantry. So what was it like from your perspective as a female in the infantry?
Well, yeah, no, that's a great question. Up until pretty much the 90s, women weren't allowed in the infantry in the Canadian military either. I believe it was 1989 when the first female was allowed to join. And since then, women in combat trades still only make up, I think around less than like 3%.
Yeah.
Within those roles, right? So it's not like it's super popular just because it's allowed, but as far as how it was, I mean, I would say pretty similar to the experience that the guys were having, which is very physically demanding, mentally demanding, and at times overwhelming, but also at times just really fun and hanging out. Though I will say a disadvantage, and I know it comes off almost like tongue in cheek, but the biggest disadvantage about being a female in the infantry was the inability to just basically pee wherever I wanted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, am I allowed to share a story? That's
yes.
Funny about.
Yeah, no,
okay.
Logistics in the military is fair game. Go for it.
Okay, so, for example, if we were in a defensive position or something, the guys could literally just, take 3 steps into the bush and it not be an issue, not have to, jingle around with kit or anything like that.
Right.
I remember having to go to the bathroom so bad that, the Blue Rockets, I don't know what you call them, porta-johns? Yeah, so, having to walk all the way there, and I'm kept talking to myself, come on, you can do it just a little bit farther, come on, and then trying to compose myself as I'm in there trying to undo my kit
I can
and everything.
Imagine. Yeah.
And one of my instructors, because I was on my sergeant's course at the time, one of my instructors, as I'm walking back, they pull me aside, they're like, hey, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. They're like, because we heard you struggling over there. I'm like, oh my like how embarrassing. Like I just really had to go to the bathroom. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The logistics of that would be very challenging. And I know since I retired in 2015. I know that they've had females come into some of the combat operations roles. I don't know how it's going. There were very few females that I ever trained with that I felt like could keep the same standards. But I did know some who could, and one that stands out to me right now was a very tiny woman. She was older than us by 10 years. She only weighed 100 pounds. But when we had to carry the 249, which was a heavy machine gun, on a long ruck march, she volunteered to do it, and she lugged that thing like a champ. So I was like, I would be suffering. She's doing great. So I know it's possible, right? I know it's possible to maintain that same standard. Well, good for you. And you know, in the infantry, we were the tip of the spear in fighting. We were the door kickers. We were the grapplers. We did a lot of jiu-jitsu. It was very hands-on physical. So it's impressive that you were able to maintain that standard and go forward. And the imagery in my mind of you as an infantry soldier and you as a beauty queen is like so drastic.
Very different. It's so different. Actually, like it's funny you mentioned the fighting, because if your trade is infantry, then you are required to do close quarter combat.
Yep.
Basic training. Like it's part of the component. And as when you're a reservist, you don't necessarily have to do that. If you're reg force, you do. However, for me, even though I was a reservist and I could have opted out, I said, no, I want to be on this course. I want to get it done. You know, I truly believe that even if you're doing something like part-time, you should still be at that same standard. But I understand, because some reservists have full-time jobs, and if they were to get critically injured on a course like that, it would affect them in their civvy life.
Yeah.
But because I was working full-time, even though I was a reservist, I was still working full-time with the Army.
Yeah.
It just made sense. And yeah, my gosh, I was so proud of myself. Like I got my nose broken on that course, and I was so happy because it was in scenarios. So you have like, you do all your training, and it's all leading up to scenario day when you fight the instructors, right?
Yep.
And I'm the only female in that course. I'm the shortest on that course, and you could toss me around like a pillow, compared to the men there that were like twice my height, right?
Yep.
And so I go with the fight with the instructors, and the very first scenario is you don't know it going into it, but it ends up being like 2 against 1, and immediately off the bat, before going in, the course warrant double checked my gloves, and he looked at me and he grabbed me by the wrists because he double checked my gloves, right? And so he's holding my wrist like this, so I'm like this, right? And he's like, okay, all you need to do is get the drunk guy out of the mess, because that's the scenario. There's a drunk guy in the mess. So I'm like, okay, but I'm so focused, right? When you think about levels of conflict and de-escalation, if you're dealing with a drunk guy and it's just a drunk guy, you're not going to come up like this, like
no
arms up or anything, right?
No.
But because I was so focused, my hands were like, I was just like, hey guy, and he turns around, because he's acting drunk, and he goes, what, you want to fight? And I do one of these, I'm like, oh no, and like before I could even say no, boom, right in the face, and broke my nose.
Oh shoot.
And just blood pouring down my face. But the funny thing was, so I get through that, I make it through that 2-on-1. The second fight is a knife fight, where the instructor has the zap knife, so when you touch it, it zaps you.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And it's funny how you don't feel the zaps when your adrenaline is so high. But when I was in that one, I could feel something running down my face, and all I could think was like, oh dear God, like I hope that's not snot. This would be so embarrassing.
Yeah.
And I kind of wipe, and I see blood. I'm like, oh yes, okay. Because for some reason in my head, I was like, while I'm focusing on just trying to make it through the scenario, in my head I was like, please don't let there be snot on my face. Like, I don't know.
But you'll accept the blood.
So, yeah, totally acceptable, right? And then you switch that, and there's a picture of me there's a picture of me, I'm just smiling, and there's blood, and then then you've got poise, dress, crown, photo, so.
Very different.
Long-winded way of saying very different.
Oh, that is so wild. I wanted to put a comment in here for reserves and talk about the benefit of reserves. I served in and around reserves several times as an active duty guy. But I tell you, the caliber of some of the reservists that I served with was just top notch, not only in intelligence, but in courage. And so my hat off to reserves who have a hard role of going right back into civilian life after a hard deployment, whereas military gets to de-escalate a little bit back in their own unit and their own base and keep training. So anyway, I have a lot of respect for reservists and Guard. In the United States, we have Guard members too that are attached to each of our states. I don't know if it works the same in Canada for provinces, but and those folks as well. Usually under-trained, under-resourced, and yet expected to do the same fight, which is hard. So
yeah, it can be. And the way I see it is a lot of times there is there can be animosity between the two, right? I get if this is your full-time job and you signed that contract where you're committed for 3, 5, 25 years, and you see someone who does it part-time, maybe getting promoted before you or getting Guccier opportunities. I understand how that could leave a bit of a sour taste in your mouth. But the way I always looked at it was, when you're on deployments, when you look at the guys and girls that we've lost overseas, specifically speaking to Afghanistan, the 158 that we lost. That was Reg Force and reserves, because at the end of the day, we're all fighting together. They're all fighting together. They're side by side. They're going through it together. I've never, even though I say I understand it, it's never really sat well with me, because if you see someone who you're like, oh, they should be doing a better job at that, then teach them, show them.
Yeah. Right.
That's been the thought.
Yep, I'm agreeing with you. When I crossed into the special operations community, there became a diversity there as well that said, oh, special is better and regular Army's not, and then you go reserve and Guard and all that. And the reality is, anybody who puts their life on hold, goes and is training to fight, training for war all the time, it's a huge sacrifice, physically and mentally. And my hat's off to everybody. So we're aligned on that, Giselle. We're aligned. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your experience while in the military. So how many years did you do before you were able to retire in the Canadian system?
In the reserves, you can pretty much what's the word I use? Release, voluntary release, at any point. Or there's other forms of release as well. There's medical release if, you no longer meet the universality of service on certain things and everything like that. So there's no real time limit or requirement of X amount of time you have to stay in, contrary to the Reg Force. We also have something called the sub-reserve, which allows someone that if they wanted to release, but not fully, so they wanted to be able to keep their qualifications, they just needed, for any reason, 1 to 5 years to be not in. Then as long as they're, I believe, unless it's changed recently, but as of how I had previously known the system, as long as they come back within those 5 years, then they keep the qualifications and the training that they had. Okay. There may or may not be a few things that they have to redo depending on if they've changed certain things, but they pretty much get to come back. So I joined in 2008. There was a time where I took a few years, about 3 years or so, and I was on sub-reserve. When I came back, I got to keep my rank and everything.
Good.
And so, even though it says 16 years, even those 3 years where I wasn't actively serving, that's where I was doing a lot of my advocacy work, and I was starting that up. So 13 years, I have 11 and a half years of full pensionable time, which kind of just goes to show how much I was working full time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the answer. So I recently retired. So it was 2024 where I retired there. And So a total of 13. So it's like 16 or 13 or 11 and a half, however you want to look at it. Right?
Yeah,
So.
yeah, interesting. And so when you talk about your system of pension, do you collect that pension right away? Do you wait until a certain age?
Oh, so it actually really depends. There are some that can get immediate annuity, where they can start collecting on their pension monthly right away. And then the other side is deferred, where they have to wait till 60, 60 and then 65, like it continues, but just different. So it really just depends. It depends on how you release, under what item you're releasing, again, if it's voluntary medical, and if you're reg force or reserve. So reservists, even if you have enough pensionable time, unfortunately, it's still the other one, like you don't get it right away.
Yeah. And I think that's very similar to the U.S. system. I was just curious to see if it was. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Well, I had a great interview yesterday with another female Canadian soldier, and she and I talked about a lot of things, some of which was really, really heavy. Military sexual trauma, her experience as a female medic, and the challenges that she endured. And I know that it's more prevalent than not that we hear of necessarily. And I know that you advocate for a lot of good things, a lot of good causes. You know, I want to tell the audience how I first found Giselle in the first place. I started an Instagram account that ties into my YouTube page, where I post all of these interviews and I post videos about veterans wellness and fitness nutrition. And I came across her page randomly and was like, this is very interesting. I saw that she was a veteran. I saw that she was an advocate. And I immediately reached out and said, hey, I would love to talk with you, hear your story, and definitely learn about the advocacy piece, which is how I know that people are doing well mentally, because in my own journey, it was impossible for me when I was struggling with PTSD so bad to be able to look outward. I was so focused inward on daily survival almost. And now I'm turned outwards. So I know that my journey has been successful. And when I see all of the advocacy that you're doing, Giselle, I know that you're in a good position in order to be able to help other people. So I commend you for that good effort. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your advocacy work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually interesting that you say that, because I would say, you know, like I'm definitely healing, but I'm also someone that, contrary, I have avoid a lot. So that's actually really motivated me to advocate more, because it's like I know there's some issues, but I don't want to really deal with it myself. So I'm just going to help this person over here. So
interesting.
But you know, like that does actually mean a lot to me that that was the feeling that you got, because then that means that like my message is coming across the way I want it to, which is, you know, I want people to be drawn in and ask questions, and then, you know, that way I can help them more. But yeah, so to say like when it started or how it started, I wouldn't necessarily say anything like pinpointed. However, as far as when I started actively reaching out and organizing events and getting that done, that was probably about a decade ago. 2013, 2014 is when I organized my first large scale event to raise money for, I believe it was Wounded Warriors Canada.
What was your motivation?
Yeah, oh man, it's funny, I was talking about this yesterday, and my friend's service dog like immediately just like came up and put his head on my lap, and I'm kind of missing the idea of being able to pet Captain right now. But yeah, my motivation was, so I grew up in the military. It was my entire life. My father was infantry. He was PPCLI, and it's how we met my mom. My mom was reserve Navy actually, and so they met in Cornwallis. And you know what happens when a reservist Navy woman meets a Patricia? They get married, and you know, then there's me and my siblings. So, you know,
good.
So I grew up in that, you know, moving around. I think that's probably why traveling and moving never has really bothered me at all because we did it a lot when you get posted regularly. And growing up during a time where even at that point, mental health was not a priority. They had some things, for example, like, hey, like, it's normal to argue before your spouse goes on a deployment or exercise because it's easier to say goodbye to somebody when you're mad, and you can say, like, no, whatever, just get out of my face, I don't want to see you right now. It's an emotional barrier that you're using to protect yourself, and easier to say goodbye to them when you're angry. Even though anger is the second emotion. I mean, the first emotion is fear. It's easier to do it that way than to say, like, I'm going to miss you. So, like, they explained that, but there's a lot of things that I saw as a child. At the time, I couldn't register them because, I mean, you're a kid. Like, you can understand and see when you scrape yourself, you have an owie, right? You hurt yourself, you fell off the bike, right? You can see it. And kids are visual. You know, they're textile, they touch things and everything, they can see it. Like, I have a scab, right? So how do you explain to kids when you can't see the damage that's inside, like inside your brain, inside your heart and your soul, right? It's hard. You understand that, hey, life was this way, and now life seems tense. And you know, like in the van, for example, this is a very easy way to kind of explain, like, as a kid, you don't even really realize it's happening. We had an Astro van, like just like an old school van, you know, sliding door on the one side. Before they got all like fancy as they are now. And with the windows that had the two buckles, so you pop it open and lock it, and so then the windows on the side of the van just were like open on a slant, like that. And then you pull the buckle up and then pop it down, and then that's how you close the window in the van on the side.
Easy to pinch your fingers.
Super easy. So the thing is, though, they also made a very distinct popping clasp sound. And you know, you never really think of it. And then, you know, dad was gone, and dad comes back because, you know, you don't register, like, dad's deployed, like, so he was gone, he came back, and then it's like after that, you know, you go to close it, but then, like, we'd have to close it so carefully. Like, I used to put my hand underneath it so it wouldn't, like, make that clasp sound, and then, like, just, like, gently put it down, because that sound would startle dad. And if he was driving, like, you don't want to startle him while he's driving, or even if he's not, you don't want to startle him, right? But looking back on that, I understand it, and I can see, like, oh, it's because it made this sound, and then that sound was triggering to him, you know, because of what he experienced. But as a kid, you're just like, oh, I don't want to get yelled at, right? But you're not getting yelled at because you're in trouble, and you're not getting yelled at because your parents, like, bad. It's because they're having a moment where their body immediately goes into fight or flight, and they have a reaction. So that, you know, looking back and processing those memories, that was really the motivating factor, is how can we do this in a way where we can help educate families and the member itself. Like, you know, you may experience this, you may go through this, family members, they may experience this, you may struggle with it, like these things. How do we do that in a proactive way that prepares them better, so that they're not having to heal from a place of reaction and unexpectancy, I guess, if that makes sense. You know, if they at least have some idea, then they have the time to prepare, and it's always better to be prepared and not go through something than to go through something and not be prepared.
Oof. Wow, everything you're saying is just resonating with me. My father was in the military as well. He never went to combat, so when I entered the military service, got into combat arms, and deployed, I was naive. I felt like I was spiritually, family supported. I was a grounded individual that nothing I saw, heard, felt would affect me here because I was good here. Boy, was I wrong. No, yeah, you talk about the sounds and the triggering. I made a video today and posted it on my channel, and I was getting ready for the day after I worked out, and the window was open in my closet, and I could hear these pop 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 pop, and my immediate thought was, what is that? Is it a gunshot? And then my mind immediately spun with the tools I've been using, and it's like, reality here. That's the construction site across the street shooting nails into the roof. So I took my camera outside and I filmed it, and I said, what do you hear? Because what I hear is not a nail gun. What I hear is 9mm and small rounds popping off. And it's all part of the same journey. I'm so glad that you shared your experience about your father and what happens before deployments. We hear a lot about people coming back and having their own struggles with readjusting to civilian life after combat, and we don't hear a lot about what happens before. And having deployed several times myself too, the tension in the house is just it is so brutal. I don't want to leave my family. I don't want to leave them for a year by themselves. My wife was pregnant with 3 young kids when I deployed again, second time. I didn't want that, but I also wanted to be ready for my unit, all the things I've trained for and ready. And there was such a challenge in between that line, and it blurred. And you're right, we almost argued right before I walked out the door. and was gone for a year. Why would anybody do that to their loved ones? And yet it's so common. And then you come home and they're like, how are you? And I'm like, I'm good. And for 2 weeks, it's the honeymoon phase. It's beautiful. I love to hear my kids' voices. And then after that 2 weeks, it's like, I don't want another sound. I don't want to be touched. I don't want so much light. I want to be in darkness. I want to, not having any idea what that struggle was. I was still just trying to cope myself. So you've hit some triggers here. and that's what I wanted. That's what I needed. So thanks for bringing that visual up, because it's so prominent. I talk to my kids. I've got 6 children, and my oldest is serving a mission for our church in Africa, in East Africa right now, and she's having an amazing experience. She's such a great girl. And I remember her junior year of high school, she said, Dad, I think I want to talk to a therapist. You talk to therapists all the time, Dad. I think I want to. And I was like, what could possibly be wrong? But you're right, those moments where I was triggered in a half second, fight or flight, always fight, it had repercussions on the family. Even if I was not violent in the home, my behavior, my moods, it affected everybody. And I'm so glad that she went through that process and processed it herself, and now she can joke with me about it. But there are consequences for the labor which we do in the military and coming home.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's wonderful. I'm so glad that she asked and sought that out. I know, for my girls, it's something that their dad and I decided, we should just let them talk, because again, it's that proactive approach, right? If they're sitting down with someone who can help them understand, primary and secondary emotions, then it's just better preparing them and easier for them to understand what it is that they're seeing their parent go through, so that they're not creating any internal wounds themselves. And also, if they have any, it allows them to heal it sooner. Right? Because when you're gone for that year, I mean, your wife didn't freeze in time, right? Dishes probably moved from one cabinet to another cabinet. My mom used to say, Dad came back and all of a sudden it was like, what do you mean they can walk to the park by themselves, right? Like things change, rules adjust, and you go from one area where you're heightened all the time, you're on alert all the time, and home is supposed to be your safe space. And then when you come back and it's not that familiar space it was when you left, how is it going to be your safe space? How can you fully actually adapt back into that if it's not what it was? It's different, and just being able to better prepare for that. And your daughter knows you love her, even though
she does.
There was things that, triggers that, you would have dealt with, just like I know that my dad loves me and my brother and my sister. And I think that's why, I can look back on that with compassion and empathy. And I can see, like, yeah, he was struggling, but why was he struggling? Why did he have to struggle so much? That's not fair. And that's what I get upset about.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm like, there needs to be more. We need to do better. We can do better, and we should be.
Yeah.
So we can now mention, like, I need a mental health day, or I need to go into the mirror and talk to a counselor just for something, and it's not going to have the same repercussions on your career that it would have had a decade ago.
Right.
But we're not doing enough. Like, just it's like dusting. You can dust your kitchen and it'll be clean, but it doesn't mean that the dust from under the cupboards or behind the stove is gone. Like, if you're just wiping the surface, you're not actually really cleaning. And sorry not to be like long-winded, but a lot of really great initiatives are being put in place by veterans who are no longer serving.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenal, and I love seeing those things. The only downside of it, and not to take away from what they're doing, so I hope that those listening don't take it that way, but when I say that, the downside to that is that they're no longer serving. So the institution that they're hoping to influence and help, they're no longer a part of. So they can only, they're capped. They can only do so much, no matter how big their heart is and how much passion they have. They can only do so much because they're no longer within that institution, which means the opportunities to make those changes are limited, which sucks. So.
It does, yeah. And I think you're right. I think this came up yesterday in our discussion with Cass, and she mentioned something similar. I said, well, how do we influence the force, especially in Canada where there's more integration of women? How do we influence them to make MST a priority so that it's less of a guy and a girl in a unit, it's a brother and a sister, and that's the relationship, right? How do we do that? And I said, maybe we speak to senior leadership. And they said, no, that's been done. We need it to be at the troop level. And you as someone trying to influence can't affect the troop level. It's got to be internal, just like you're saying. And that's the hard question mark if we really want to make some changes in some of these areas. When I came back from Iraq, they put us in the holding area as a unit. And they said, we know we're back in the States, but you've got 6 days to go through all of these meetings and processes in order to go and see your family that's waiting for you around the corner. And so they put me into this office with this guy, and he kind of pushed his glasses up, and pulls out his board, and he's like, do you have PTSD? I was like, no.
That's how it works.
Get me the freak out of this room. I want to go see my wife and kids. And of course I had PTSD. Of course I'd seen traumatic things. Of course I'd done traumatic things. Of course there was lingering effects. But putting a guy in front of me that I had no relationship with, who has a clipboard, and he's like, yes or no, was not the answer for what any of us needed. I hope that the voice of veterans can affect what happens inside the service now when we have this experience. Some of these analogies that you've made are so identifiable. I wish there was a pamphlet we could hand to every service member before they come home and say, just read Mrs. Canada's statement on reintegration, and and maybe they would take some notes and be like, oh, well, if she had it or if he had it, sure enough, I'm going to have some struggles when I get home, and here's what I need to watch for. That would have helped immensely, I think.
Yeah, it really is that knowing what to watch for, but then also, because you can have someone say, hey, I think you should talk to somebody, something's not right here. But if the person isn't receptive, then, and they have a wall built up around them, it really doesn't matter how many times you say it. They're going to tell you, no, I'm fine, which is really what you're conditioned to say, especially as you would know yourself. Like in a combat role, like the infantry, you're conditioned. Like, no, I'm fine. Yeah, I'll walk it off. No,
Yeah.
Everything's fine. Right? So there's that, the understanding, like Cass was saying yesterday, within at the base level of the demonstration, I guess, of vulnerability is the easiest way to say it. And it doesn't mean that you have to cry, because I don't like crying in front of people. And when I used to teach, I would see the few times that would have females going through training. If I saw them getting emotional and cry, I would take them aside. And granted, I could have said it a little softer, but basically I was like, wipe your face. You will not cry in front of these men, because any chance of them treating you as an equal is going to be gone if they see you cry, because now you're going to be associated as emotional. Okay. And we can't have that. Like, draw in your own time. And I know that's probably a terrible thing to say, but like what I was trying to get across was like, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And if those words that I said, if anyone is listening, and maybe I said those words to you and that hurt you in some way, I do apologize, because that was not my intent. But when I say like it's okay to be vulnerable, I mean it in the sense of not having to put on this front of, I'm fine, this doesn't bother me. If something bothers you, say so. Don't be dumb about saying it.
Yeah.
Don't come out and be like, argumentative, or shut up, blah, 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 blah. Like, just communicate like a human being and say like, hey, like, that actually bothers me, and have a discussion. That is an example of vulnerability, because conflict, or embracing conflict, is the same thing as being vulnerable.
Yeah.
You have to be vulnerable to embrace conflict, because you have to embrace conflict knowing this might hurt.
Yeah.
This might not have a good outcome. That is vulnerability. It doesn't mean crying.
I like
but it
that.
just means understanding, like, I might not like the answer I'm going to get, but I'm still going to ask the question. And if they understood that and practiced that more, then I think they would be more, ideally, I would think they would be more receptive when someone came forward, if someone were to come forward and say, hey, I think you might need to talk to somebody. Or maybe even simpler than that. Hey, you seem a little off.
Right.
What's going on in your mind right now?
Right. Yeah, that's a better way to phrase it, for sure. When I became an infantry officer, and I took my platoon, my company commander took us aside and he said, as an officer in the Army, you don't get hungry, you don't get tired, you don't get cold, you don't get hot, you don't get hurt, and you don't get sick. And I was like, got it. I'm not going to be hurt. I'm not going to get sick. And I was hurt and I was sick. I just couldn't show it. I just couldn't show it. And no, I appreciate those words. As we get to the last couple of minutes of this interview here, you've given us a lot of great advice that I hope people are writing down and taking notes for here, because it's super important, and I know I have been.
Thank you.
If you could say a couple of words to our audience today and talk about your advice to them for their wellness journey out of a trauma situation into a triumphal situation, like you said, you're still working on today and making improvements, and visually from the outside looking in, it looks like you're doing well, and I want to congratulate you for that. But what advice would you offer?
I would say it's exactly what I said about embracing conflict. Paired with that, though, knowing when to disengage. That personally is something that I'm working on a lot. Is knowing when to disengage and just recognize the situation for what it is, and stepping away for the sake of myself, so that I don't get pulled in and end up, having pretty much like a panic attack. Just recognizing, like, hey, I can't give myself to this mentally. I need to lighten my mental load. I need to disengage. There's always so much pressure that we put on ourselves. Like, yeah, there's pressure put on us by other people. There's always pressure put on ourselves, especially when we come from roles where we are expected to perform, no matter the weather, the injury,
Right.
the ground. There's an expected outcome of our performance and our energy. Provider, protector, everything like that. So when we've worked so long already being in that role, we are now holding ourselves to a standard that anything less must mean, and I say this within quotations, that we are weaker and we are lesser than and not worthy. And the thing is, and you said it yourself, like, you're not allowed to get hurt or sick or anything, and that makes sense. As an infantry officer, like, you're leading, you need to lead by example, and you're also responsible for morale. Morale is incredibly important, but that doesn't give you any wiggle room for when you are hurting and when you do have a sniffle. It's hard, and we need to not put as much pressure on ourselves. Like I said yesterday in another interview, failure is not an end stop. It's not the end game. It doesn't mean give up. It just gives you an opportunity to reapproach, adapt. I mean, like, it's the infantry, right?
Yeah.
Improvise, adapt, overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Failure is literally that. Just a chance to improvise, adapt, and get through it. And, you don't have to do it by yourself. That's the thing. You shouldn't have to do it by yourself.
And I appreciate you suggesting that there's a need for recovery and step back sometimes to regather.
Yeah.
I put a video out recently as I was walking with a weighted vest for my exercise, and I talked about recovery, that there's a need for mental, physical, emotional recovery. And when you need to take the time, take it. It's just part of the journey. Giselle, you've been incredible, and your wisdom is far beyond your age. Thank you very much for imparting that to us today, and I look forward to more engagement in the future. I'll put Giselle's information down below so you can follow her and her journey for her pageant, as well as her podcast, which she's done some wonderful interviews with some amazing people. And for your advocacy work, we salute you, and thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you so much.